BIOL 100, Chapter 37, the endocrine system. All right, so the endocrine system is all of your organs and tissues that produce hormones. What are hormones? We've heard a lot about hormones, I'm sure, whether it's an excuse, not saying it's not a valid excuse for something happening or a way you're feeling, or if you know someone going through puberty and you're talking about hormones, but hormones are just regulatory chemicals that are secreted into extracellular fluid and then carried by the blood. There's both kind of an endocrine and an exocrine system, which is explained even a little bit more in the Amoeba Sisters video that's posted on Lalima. There's also another video here that was suggested from your book, and I posted this video as well. I don't know if it's as good as the Amoeba one, but if you're wanting to know a little bit more about hormones and what they are, how they're regulated, this might be of interest to you. But yeah, hormones are basically just regulatory chemicals going around your body and binding onto things and telling your body, certain organs, how to act, what needs to be done, right? And we'll dive into that deeper as we go through this lecture. But multicellular animals, including ourselves, we need hormones in order to help maintain homeostasis, which is our body being in its happy place, right? Our pH, our temperature, all of those things. And so what happens is a hormone will travel to a cell that has a receptor for that hormone, and then it will attach and it will induce some sort of cellular response. Now, it depends on what the receptor is and what the hormone is, what's going to happen. And again, we'll get into that more in just a second. But remember that in order for hormones to latch on and to induce some sort of cellular response, you do have to have a receptor. Okay, so let's get into some different types of hormones that we have. Up first, we have our lipid-derived hormones. These are derived from, well, lipids, which is like fats, right? So mostly from cholesterol. So they're structurally very similar to that, but these are also our steroid hormones. So like ketones, alcohol, usually these will end in an OL, and that's how you know it's a lipid-derived hormone. Uh, Different examples include like estrogen, like estradiol, androgens, like testosterone, and both of these regulate bone and tissue development in humans, regulate other things as well. But these are lipid-derived hormones, so these are a little bit less complex than some of the other hormones that we're about to go into. Alrighty, up next we have amino acid derived hormones. These are just like it sounds. They are hormones that are derived from amino acids. They're relatively small and they're derived from either tyrosine or tryptophan. And if it's amino acid derived, it's basically going to end in INE or IN, right? Examples of this are epinephrine or norepinephrine, epinephrine being your fight or flight response. We talked a little bit about that last week. And these guys up here are synthesized in the medulla of your adrenal glands, while something like thyroxine is produced by your thyroid gland. The pineal gland in your brain is what is making and secreting melatonin, which is derived from tryptophan. You might know or have heard about melatonin if you take it to help you sleep at night. Helps regulate your sleep cycles or your circadian rhythms. All of these are derived from amino acids. And up next we have peptide hormones. So peptide hormones are a little bit bigger, a little bit more structurally complex. They are made up of polypeptide chains, which are just chains of amino acids. If you remember when we talk about mono and poly meaning many, right? So made up of lots of different kinds of peptide hormones, which include molecules that have short polypeptide chains. So things like oxytocin, growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, those are all much larger than those that we talked about that are lipid derived or derived from cholesterol, or even the amino acid derived. So some of these are produced by the brain and then they're released into the blood by our posterior pituitary gland. Some of them include like small proteins that have like growth hormone. That's also produced by the pituitary. And then there's other ones like this follicle stimulating hormone. That one is also produced by the pituitary. So different kinds of hormones here. And again, we'll get into more examples of them, but these are the three different types of hormones we have: lipid derived, amino acid derived, and our peptide hormones. So essentially getting more complex as we get to peptide hormones. Okay, important to note, comparison of nervous and endocrine systems. We've gone over the nervous system kind of briefly, and you know that the nervous system controls nerve impulses conducted by axons. Those responses are really quick, right? They're happening in milliseconds. We're sending action potentials, we're deciding what we want to do, what muscles we're going to move, all of those things, whether it's in the autonomic nervous system or if we're purposely trying to do something. So our nervous system is relatively local. It has very specific effects. And when you stop or when the stimulus stops, it can adapt really quickly. So the nervous system is also associated with the endocrine system. There are certain hormones that are acting on your nervous system, which is why we would then refer to it as the neuroendocrine system. But again, this happens really quickly and usually pretty locally. Then when we get into talking about the endocrine system, this is controlling your hormones that are transported in the blood. So this can have really widespread general effects. And remember, we talked about hormones need a specific receptor in order to induce a cellular response. Those responses can take seconds or they can take days. Some are really prolonged, some adapt really slowly, some change your body completely over time. It depends on what hormones we're talking about. And remember, we have to have those receptors in order to receive these hormones, but there are sometimes receptors for different hormones in different parts of your body. So you might be able to receive one hormone in like 4 different places, whereas with the nervous system, it's usually pretty localized and there's usually very specific places that you're going to be able to receive those signals. Endocrine system is throughout your body and there's very specific places in some cases, but also in other cases it can be in lots of different places or lots of different systems that are affected. Okay, so hormones are still very specific. Remember, they need that specific receptor in order to work. And in order for that receptor to work, or once that receptor has received a hormone, I should say, really, it will change its cellular activity. Again, they might be found on lots of different kinds of cells, or they might be limited to a small number of specialized cells. It depends on what hormone we're talking about. And the number of receptors can change as well. So in upregulation, what happens is the number of receptors is increasing in response to rising hormone levels. And so it'll make your cell more sensitive to that hormone and it allows for more cellular activity. Downregulation is obviously the opposite. So the number of receptors is decreasing in response to a rising hormone level and then your cellular activity is reduced. So we can either upregulate or downregulate. And again, these hormone receptors can be found within the cell or they can also be found on the plasma membranes. So it depends on what kind of hormone it is and how it's going to be received by certain cells. We do also have intracellular hormone receptors. So when we talked about those lipid-derived hormones, those ones can bind to transport proteins. So once they reach the target cell, they're released from their carrier protein, and then they pass through the plasma membrane and bind to a target within the cell. Lipophilic, remember philic meaning loving, phobic meaning hating, right? So philic, lipo would mean that it loves these lipids, basically. So we can cross the membrane and bind to intracellular receptors. And then that hormone receptor complex is regulates transcription by increasing or decreasing the synthesis of messenger RNA or mRNA. Kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because we're going to talk a little bit more about DNA, RNA, genetics in the last part of this class, but just know that it can affect that in these lipid-derived hormones. Okay, so how do intracellular hormone receptors work? Again, these are for our lipid-derived hormones, so that means they're soluble, and these are mostly like our steroid hormones, right? And they can diffuse across the membranes of the endocrine cell, and once they're outside of it, they bind to transport proteins that keep them soluble in the bloodstream. So then at the target cell, the hormones are released from the carrier protein and diffused across the lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane of the cells. So you can see the hormone coming in here, diffusing across the membrane. Then it's going to hook up with a transport protein, and then that's going to go through the plasma membrane of the target cell and adhere to intracellular receptors within the cytoplasm or within the nucleus here. So you can see this nuclear pore. This is our nucleus here. And again, a little bit ahead of ourselves because in the nucleus is where our DNA is and where we're messing with transcription and then translation later on as well. But that hormone receptor complex can bind to a DNA sequence called a hormone response element, or an HRE, and that's going to trigger gene transcription and translation. So basically what happens is the protein can then mediate changes in your cell function. Going into transcription and translation is essentially making new proteins for your body. So in these intracellular hormone receptors, when we're receiving these lipid-derived hormones like steroids, these can actually alter what proteins our body is making. Okay, so remember we talked about that there's an endocrine and an exocrine system, and the Amoeba Sisters video probably explains this pretty well. But endocrine So endocrine means that it's just being released straight into the cell's environment, basically. And exocrine means that it has ducts and it's being transported out. So things like sweat glands, that would be considered exocrine system. So our excretory system, this is where we're talking about maintaining water balance, and then we're going into the use of ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Maybe you've heard of that before, but what it does is it regulates the amount of water excreted by the kidneys, and it's therefore helping regulate your blood pressure. So more antidiuretic hormone is released when water levels of the bloodstream are lower. So this is what things called osmoreceptors are doing, is they're sensing your water levels in the kidneys so that they can understand how to best counteract changes in that, right? If we're underproducing antidiuretic hormone, that can cause diabetes insipidus, which is different than diabetes mellitus, which is like type 1 and type 2. So we want to be able to basically excrete the correct amount of antidiuretic hormone to make sure that we can regulate our blood pressure appropriately. We also have another hormone called aldosterone. This is the steroid hormone. This is produced by the adrenal cortex, and it is the main regulator of water and electrolytes like sodium and potassium within our body. It also promotes the reabsorption of water, and it's released due to the signaling of the renin-angiotensin system. So it's getting a little bit hormones can, again, this can take a whole semester lecture if we wanted to, or even beyond. So we're just scratching the surface, just telling you about a few hormones in your body and what they do, and hopefully giving you some idea of things maybe that you've heard of or that you've seen on blood tests that your doctor has asked for, something like that. But this is released due to signaling of the renin-angiotensin system, whereas ADH, antidiuretic hormone that we just talked about, is released with the function of osmoreceptors. So these are doing sort of similar things in your body, but they are released by and regulated by different parts of your body. And here we're also kind of adding in the electrolytes like sodium and potassium as well, and not just regulating water. Okay, so getting into the reproductive system, different hormones that can affect us there. So there's a lot going on in our reproductive system as well, right? And this is requiring action of hormones from all of the lots of different systems: our pituitary gland, our adrenal cortex, the gonads. And during puberty in both males and females, you have your hypothalamus is producing another type of hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is then stimulating production and release of this follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. So in males, that's basically maturing sperm cells. In females, it's developing egg cells. And those are being produced from the anterior pituitary gland, as well as this luteinizing hormone, LH, which in males is producing testosterone, and in females is surging, or its surge causes ovulation. Okay. We also have oxytocin, which does several things in your body, but one thing of note in the reproductive system is that it stimulates uterine contraction during childbirth. Your book goes more into detail in some of this, and I'm not super concerned with all the details as long as you kind of understand the basic concepts of it. If it's something that you're interested in, by all means, take a deeper look reading your book or watching some of these videos. But it is interesting, and again, a lot of these, like, they're often called like sex hormones even. Testosterone is, all of these hormones are really within all males and females, but we have different levels of them, right, depending on whether you're biologically a male or female. And there are differences in how it reacts with your body. So the androgens, like testosterone, are higher in the males, and that's overall producing like certain male sex characteristics, right? And then you have the same thing with the female, like estradiol and progesterone, that are higher, and they're promoting different female sex characteristics to develop as well. And testosterone is promoting production of sperm, and also like growth and development of testes and penis. It's increased skeletal and muscular growth, enlargement of the larynx, increased growth and redistribution of hair. It's doing a lot of different things in males that it's not quite as heavy as in the females, right? And testosterone is secreted by a couple different places. So it's regulated by both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And then the hypothalamus is also releasing hormones that stimulate the release of gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary gland. I know that this might all sound like a lot of gibberish if you're not familiar with these systems, and that's okay. There's a lot of vocab in this system, and understanding different hormones and different places that these hormones are regulated and secreted by. So I recommend looking at the book and kind of understanding that, because this is more of a memorization chapter rather than an understanding chapter, really. Okay, and then hormones that affect metabolism. Insulin, we've probably heard of. That one's produced by beta cells of the pancreas, and it lowers blood sugar by increasing cellular uptake and utilization by cells. If you have a deficiency in insulin, that is when you can potentially get diabetes mellitus, and that's the reason why our diabetics need insulin, right? They need to increase their insulin so that they can lower their blood sugar. Glucagon, this is the antagonist to insulin, which means that it's essentially going to do the opposite. So it's produced by alpha cells of the pancreas, and it's going to raise blood sugar by telling the liver, hey, you need to break down more glycogen so that we can increase our glucagon and raise our blood sugar. Insulin and glucagon regulate blood glucose levels together, so you'll see blood glucose levels rise, and what the pancreas will do is it'll release insulin to bring it down, and then target cells are going to take up the glucose. The liver is going to convert glucose to glycogen, and then our blood glucose level is going to fall. Once it falls, then the pancreas is going to release glucagon. And in response to glycogen, the liver is then going to break down that glycogen and release glucose into the blood, causing our blood glucose level to rise. So this is a natural process that happens, and we want our blood glucose level to rise and fall within a certain parameter. We don't want it to go too high or too low, right? But if it goes too high or too low, or we have this variation too much, then that's when we have to get involved with it and change things with in our body, whether that's increasing insulin or maybe there's other hormones in effect as well. Okay, so other than those hormones, we can also regulate our metabolism by these things called thyroid hormones. You remember kind of at the beginning of this semester, we talked about basal metabolic rate, our BMR, and I believe you calculated out your BMR, and that's the amount of calories required by your body at rest. This is determined by thyroxine and triiodiothionine, which are T4 and T3. These are released from the thyroid gland in response to stimulation by TSH. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also produced by the anterior pituitary. And if you've ever heard of hypo or hyperthyroidism, basically hypothyroidism means that you have a low metabolic rate. So this usually is followed by weight gain, really sensitive to cold, lethargy, that feeling of kind of lazy or just no energy. Hyperthyroidism means that you have a really high metabolic rate. So that's followed usually by weight loss, irritability, and increased heart rate. All of these things that are regulated by our thyroid hormones. So if you ever get tested for your thyroid, or you have a suspicion that maybe your thyroid hormones are off and that's why you're having trouble losing weight, or maybe that's why you're having trouble keeping weight on, that could potentially be an issue with your thyroid. Keep in mind, I'm not saying these things so that you run to the doctor and say, my teacher said I have an issue with my thyroid. There's so many things that go into play, and you'll see how many hormones are associated with different parts of your body and different processes. But it doesn't just mean that it's just one of them. Sometimes it's a lot of them. And it takes a lot of testing and a lot of getting to know your body to understand how your body is functioning and what the optimal levels are. So take all of this with a grain of salt. If any of these relate to you, if you're like, oh yeah, I have a really hard time keeping weight on, that doesn't just mean that something's wrong with your thyroid. Is it possible? Yes, but I'm just saying keep all these in mind and don't run off to the doctor or anything based on any of this. I'm not trying to give any sort of doctor advice. Moving on to controlling our blood calcium levels. Calcium is regulated by something called PTH, which is produced by our parathyroid glands. And that's released in response to low blood calcium levels, whereas we have calcitonin, which is the antagonist, also produced by the thyroid gland. And again, antagonist just means that it's the opposite, right? So it's going to have the opposite effect on the body, and it's going to instead inhibit blood calcium levels or decrease blood calcium levels by inhibiting osteoclasts, which stimulate osteoblasts and then stimulate calcium secretion by the kidneys. Remember, osteo meaning bone, so basically our bone forming cells, whereas PTH, if you have low blood calcium levels, basically what that's going to do is it's going to increase your blood calcium levels and increase them by targeting like your skeleton, kidneys, your intestine, and it'll also stimulate osteoclasts, which then causes your bone to be reabsorbed, which releases calcium from your bone into your blood. So it's doing this through a pretty complicated pathway, but the main thing I'd like you to know in here is that this is what is regulating your blood calcium levels for the most part within your body. These are the hormones. Hormonal control of growth. Growth and cell replication are replicated by something called growth hormone. Very straightforward hormone name, GH. This stimulates growth, cell reproduction, and cell regeneration, and it increases the rate of protein synthesis, and it's glucose sparing. It's regulated by growth hormone releasing and inhibiting hormones that are coming from your hypothalamus. Okay, Stress. We always hear stress is really bad for us and we want to limit the amount of stress. These are our steroid hormones that we were talking about, like epinephrine, which is our fight or flight from our adrenal gland. This is what's causing short-term stress or being released during short-term stress. Long-term stress is more like cortisol from your adrenal gland, also anti-inflammatory. Okay, so when we talked about the nervous system, we talked about this little thing called the hypothalamus here that's almost like directly in the middle. And that is integrating our endocrine and our nervous system. There's a whole lot going on here. We basically call this like our relay center, one of our relay centers, right? And it synthesizes and secretes a lot of different regulatory hormones that control endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary as well. The pituitary gland that you've kind of been hearing about during this is also known as the hypophysis. I usually refer to it as just the pituitary gland, and that's hanging by a stalk from the hypothalamus. So that little relay center that we've been talking about in the brain, it has two different parts of it. It has the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary that are both part of this pituitary gland. So when you hear about the anterior pituitary, it'll appear glandular, like it just looks like a little gland basically hanging off of it. And it's not actually part of the brain. So our hypothalamus is releasing neurohormones into our anterior pituitary, which causes our anterior pituitary to then release these tropic hormones. So these are hormones that work on other endocrine glands. Tropic hormones working on other endocrine glands. The posterior pituitary, on the other hand, posterior meaning like behind, this is actually, and you'll see it's called neurohypophysis versus adenohypophysis. Neuro meaning brain. So this is actually part of the brain, or posterior pituitary, and it appears fibrous because it has lots of axons coming from the hypothalamus. And this will release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin as well. So these are the pituitary gland in general, both the anterior and the posterior pituitary, are very involved in releasing and regulating hormones throughout the body. So you can see here the hypothalamus, and again, the anterior pituitary, not part of the brain, and then the posterior pituitary that is back here and is part of the brain. The anterior pituitary produces at least 7 essential hormones. It has different peptide hormones like adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates your adrenal to make cortisol, remember our long-term stress. Melanin stimulating hormone stimulates dispersion of pigment. Protein hormones like growth hormone, prolactin. This is what stimulates your mammary glands if you're having a baby or anything like that. Glycoprotein hormones. We also have thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, that's acting on your thyroid. Luteinizing hormone, we talked about, that's acting on your ovaries or your testes, depending on your male or female. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, is developing your ovarian follicles or developing your sperm, again, depending on whether you're male or female. So lots of different functions and hormones, again, within this anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, a little bit more simple in comparison. And again, this is part of the brain. But these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus in the brain and then stored in special cells within our posterior pituitary. So antidiuretic hormone, again, our water regulator, and then oxytocin, which is kind of part of our happy regulator, but it also does other things like um, cause like contractions during childbirth and stuff like that. Okay, so these adrenal glands that we've been talking about, these are actually right on top of the kidneys. Um, Plasma membrane hormone receptors. So we talked about those amino acid derived hormones, as well as those big polypeptides, and those ones cannot just pass through the plasma membrane. Remember, our plasma membrane has a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic part. Hydrophilic means can't cross the membrane. They have to bind to the receptor on the membrane. And so these guys will bind to the receptor on the outside surface of the plasma membrane and initiate a signal pathway called the second messenger system. You can see here if we've got a hormone coming on here, like let's say epinephrine, it's going to bind here. This is a beta adrenergic receptor on the plasma membrane of the cell, and that hormone binding is going to activate something called a G protein, which is then going to activate adenyl cyclase, which is converting ATP, which is basically our cell's energy currency, right? That's how we turn glucose into energy, and we can power our cell functions that way. So it's going to convert ATP into something called CAMP. CAMP is a second messenger. So remember, we called this a second messenger system, the plasma membrane hormone receptors. And the CAMP is the second messenger that mediates a cell specific response. An enzyme then called phosphodiesterase will break down that CAMP and terminate the signal. Okay, so CAMP is going to cause that cell-specific response, and then it's going to break down into AMP, and then into phosphodiesterase is going to completely stop the signal from happening anymore. Again, you don't have to memorize this. It's just important to understand how intricate these systems can be and how important they are in maintaining homeostasis in our body. And there's so many different classes of hormones, so many different things that they do, and so many different ways that they can affect your body, whether you're feeling great, whether you're feeling not so great, if you're trying to get pregnant, if you're developing differently. So many different things that go into it, and it really is really complex pathways and complex systems. So want you to understand that, get a little taste of it, understand what some of these hormones are doing in your body and how they are regulated, where they're being released from. Again, for the most part, what we talked about is happening in the hypothalamus, whether that's the anterior or posterior pituitary gland or your adrenal glands, which are just sitting on top of your kidneys. But hopefully you learned something about hormones. Again, I would do some of the reading in your book and watch some of the videos that are posted on La Lima as well. That'll help to understand it a little bit more too.